Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Todd Hultman looks at corn and soybean markets. Tamra Jackson-Ziems discusses corn seedling diseases. Bryce Anderson forecasts spring planting weather. And Nathan Mueller talks about precision ag tools. DTN's Todd Hultman is our grain market analyst this week. The USDA Thursday released its latest estimates on world supply and demand. The agency lowered soybean ending stocks 15 million bushels to 370 million. It raised corn ending stocks by 50 million bushels by reducing expected feed and residual use. Internationally, the USDA believes stronger yields will raise Argentina's soybean production by 1 million metric tons for a record output of 57 million metric tons. Brazil's remained unchanged at 94.5 million metric tons. We talked with Todd Wednesday afternoon before the report and began by looking at how markets have reacted after numbers on stocks and prospective plantings were released on the 31st.
On the 31st, Jeff, it was a little bit bearish for corn mainly, and that's where the surprise was. We had a few more acres than were expected, and the March 1 stocks total for corn was higher than expected. So that gave corn a big one-day sell-off, but it's regrouped pretty well since then and trended steady.
So you wrote this week about the demand pace for soybeans, and you say it's blistering. Describe to me what that means. Yeah,
it's very surprising to me. At the start of this year, if you go back to last fall, we just had a record harvest here in the U.S., lots of beans. We started out the season with 4 billion bushels of soybeans. March 1 stocks, here we are at the halfway point, and we're down to 1.3 billion bushels. That means 2/3 of our soybean supply is gone. So how does the second half demand going to come out? That's the big question. If I look back historically, second half demand for soybeans is obviously going to be slower because we're going to have the competition of Brazil. There's no argument there. But the question is how much slower? Over the past 10 years, soybean demand in the second half has ranged from 26 to 38%. Only 3 times has it been below 30%, and all 3 of those times, soybean prices had to be above $14 to help ration that demand. We don't have anything like that now. So if we have 30% use in the second half, conservatively speaking, we're down closer to 100 million bushels than we are 385.
So what does that mean for prices in that near term then?
Well, you'd think they'd be climbing higher right now, but the market's been very slow to come to understand this. What we do see, though, is a strong reaction from the commercial side of the market. They are heavily long in the soybean futures market, a bit of a surprise, but not when you understand the demand that may lie in front of us. At the heart of this is understanding China's appetite, and that's the real thing that's hard to guess. It's been hard for USDA to estimate, and that's no criticism of USDA, but it's a very dynamic environment. It's tough to outguess, and USDA, 5 of the past 7 years, has underestimated demand. I think they're doing it again.
You've also written about the overall world supply in 2015. What catches your eye when you look at that?
You know, I've been around commodities a long time, and it seems like every year there's a theme. Last year we had phenomenal growing conditions, not only here in the U.S., set aside the southwestern plains, but just about every major wheat region around the world had good growing weather last year. That was a phenomenal confluence of events. Here in 2015, I think the theme is much different. We have low grain prices around the world. We have some major growing areas with some very problematic economies. Ukraine and Russia are both seeing serious declines in their currencies. Credit is hard to obtain. Their input prices are rising because their currencies are dropping so rapidly. So they're caught in a very tough situation, and they're likely to use much less fertilizer and maybe go to a lower yielding seed. So overall, I think there's going to be a trend around the world this year of lower yields, and that's before we even talk about weather.
So the strength of the dollar, you focused on that a little bit as well. A lot of people have in grains and outside. Tell me how it's affecting exports and what you think it might do, how strong or weak it might get.
Okay. Well, the dollar is definitely bearish for exports, particularly wheat, where the grain is more competitive overseas. We haven't seen it hurt soybean exports so much. But sometimes I think the dollar gets too much blame for what's going on. There is a strong fundamental trend for it. It is justified. Europe's having problems. They're very slow. At the same time, we're growing, and we're talking about raising our interest rates very soon, and that's what's really attracting investors to the dollar. Yes, that does hurt our grain exports, but not overall. The bigger concern for grain this year is going to be competition of supplies around the world.
What's your near-term outlook on prices for both corn and soybeans, and where you think producers might be able to target a few sales?
Okay. You know, if you asked me this a year ago, it would have been much easier to answer this question. We had $5 corn and $14 beans. Now we've got new crop corn prices under $4 and likewise on beans. So this is very tough what to do here. Corn has a neutral fundamental outlook. I don't see any big change this year unless we have a weather surprise, and that's probably going to keep prices around that $4 level. But I don't see a big sell-off. But that's not great news for guys renting ground, I understand. On the soybean side, because of the demand situation, I do feel that there is an opportunity to trade higher. But still, it's, I think, always a good idea to look at cheap put options to protect yourself on the downside. And the good news is the past 3 to 4 months, trading in grains has been so quiet and the volatility has been so low that those option premiums have really come down. So there is an opportunity here to at least give yourself a floor, so if something bad does happen, you can at least sleep at night.
Next week, Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag will give us his thoughts on corn and soybean markets. We'll also look at cattle markets with Oklahoma State Extension livestock marketing specialist Daryl Peel. Trade data for the month of February showed U.S. meat exports were down again from a year ago levels, but not as steep as January. Beef and veal exports for the month were about 3% lower from February 2014, while imports were up nearly 49%. The top destination for beef and veal exports was Japan, which took almost a quarter of those shipments. Mexico held the second spot and South Korea the third. U.S. pork exports for the second month of the year were down 10% from February 2014, while imports were 32% higher. Mexico imported a third of this country's pork export total. Japan and South Korea were second and third. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, the USDA Risk Management Agency has set April 10th as the initial planting date for corn in the southeastern half of Nebraska and April 15th as the initial date in the northwestern half. Soil temps taken at 4 inches Wednesday range from low 40s in the state's north to upper 50s in the far west and southwest. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says soil warming from the low 50s would be conducive for corn planting, but cool weather and cold conditions can lead to disease issues. We talked with Tamra Wednesday morning on the fields north of UNL's East Campus and began by looking back at problems in the 2014 corn crop.
Well, last year we had a lot of seedling diseases and seed decay problems, and that was most likely because of the extended period of cold, wet weather that we had that we weren't expecting. And so several diseases are favored by those cold, wet conditions, and we certainly saw them in 2014.
Can you explain how the cold, wet weather affects the seed, what it does?
Well, one of the things that happens is it inhibits seed germination and plant emergence. And so that is one thing that works against us, because the plant, if it's able to germinate and emerge very quickly, it can actually avoid or overcome some of those infections.
So with soil temperatures the way they are right now, should producers look at planting any differently? Should they wait for them to warm up more? I guess, how do you approach this planting season?
Well, I would certainly wait until conditions are optimal, or at least close to optimal, so that you get good seed germination and emergence. But certainly I would look closely at some of the records from the past years, and especially 2014, and look at fields that may have had problems in the past with seedling diseases, or if you have had drainage issues, if we do have a wet period around planting time. And waiting just a few days or waiting to plant that field last might help you overcome some of those problems, giving it a chance to warm up a little bit or dry out.
What problems does it lead to with stand establishment and equal stand, things like that?
Well, for sure, seedling diseases can, of course, kill these plants. They cause pre-emergence damping off, and those are the plants that will succumb to the disease and die. And so that will have a big impact on stand establishment. And so that would be the biggest concern about that. And not necessarily in wet conditions. We've had some very, very dry conditions in some of the state, and there are other pathogens that do impact corn and soybean in dry conditions.
Which are?
So the most common pathogen that we've had a problem with is Pythium, and that's going to require cool, wet conditions. But we've had other pathogens like Rhizoctonia and Fusarium that will also take advantage of those dry conditions as well. And so seedling diseases in general will take advantage of whatever conditions we've got.
How effective have seed treatments been in these situations?
Well, the good news is all of our commercial seed corn is treated with usually a cocktail of seed treatment fungicides and often an insecticide and or nematicide on top of that. Well, these fungicide combinations are very wide modes of action, and so they are very effective, but under stressful conditions for the plant, the pathogens can overcome that, and especially if the plants have not emerged rapidly.
So once that corn starts coming up, are there things that people should be looking at to see if, or indications of problems, I guess?
Certainly, I would be out walking the fields looking for any stand problems and emergence problems, and it'll help you anticipate whether you're going to have an issue or not.
In the situation that there would be a replant scenario, do you do anything differently then?
You know, sometimes not really, I guess is the short answer, because by the time you are able to get out and replant, if you have to do so, often the conditions have changed enough that you wouldn't have the same problem again. And that's probably good news, because you probably would not be able to get another seed treatment on your new seed anyway because of the time crunch.
The Market Journal website features videos on corn diseases for help in identifying problems throughout the growing season. It can be found under the MJ Extras tab on the Market Journal website. The latest U.S. drought monitor from UNL shows only a slight increase for Nebraska. 68% of the state is now classified as abnormally dry, with 22% of that, the same as last week, listed in moderate drought. Much of Nebraska's winter wheat crop has lacked sufficient moisture over the winter, and the damage is adding up. The USDA's crop progress report showed this week 30% of the state's winter wheat is in poor to very poor condition, the highest percentage among the top 18 producing states. For many farmers in Nebraska, the lack of precipitation or the presence of too much is now eyed as planting season begins. On Wednesday, we talked with DTN senior ag meteorologist Bryce Anderson to get an outlook for those with upcoming field work. But to start, we asked for an update on soil moisture conditions across Nebraska.
Going from east to west, eastern Nebraska, from the Missouri River toward Columbus, really is in pretty good shape. And then you start kind of running into some lighter amounts. By the time we get west of Highway 183, then we're starting to really take things down. And there's been pretty extensive drought issues now start to show up in portions of west central Nebraska and then on to the Panhandle. A lot of the south central part of the state and then through the west has at least drought 0. And we're starting to get concerned maybe about drought level 1, moderate drought.
Yeah, that area to the west, just a little bit further on how concerned you actually are for that area.
Well, I'm very concerned about how, in particular, southwestern and western Nebraska are going to fare with the lack of moisture that we've seen during the water year. The soil moisture has not really shown up very much. We've seen a lack of snowfall, and the way the rainfall pattern is acting, that portion of the state is going to have a real task in terms of being able to collect a lot of precipitation here going into the next time period now, in the next couple weeks anyway.
Describe the moisture condition farther to the east in Iowa, eastern Corn Belt.
When you go from Iowa east, things are really quite well supplied on soil moisture. Now, northern Iowa and northwestern Iowa have some dryness, but from central Iowa on east, you're looking at adequate to surplus. and particularly in southern Illinois through the Ohio Valley, they've been very wet, and there's been terrific flooding in some cases in Kentucky, and some very saturated soils. Farther to the north, Minnesota is in moderate drought. The eastern Dakotas are as well, but the pattern, the upper air pattern, is kind of coming around to the point that it offers that part of the Midwest a better chance for precipitation, so it's not like it's going to be a chronic long-term feature in our opinion.
So as you look at Nebraska and a large portion of the growing area in the eastern two-thirds, what's the short-term outlook for precipitation during the planting season?
It's going to be, precipitation is going to be, I think, quite generous. Our call is for the next couple weeks that we're going to see normal to above normal amounts over the Midwest. And again, the greatest chance for above normal would be in that southeastern Corn Belt area. You get farther north, and I think moisture is going to be pretty much welcome. Are we going to see some planting delays? Yes, we will. Are they going to be to the extent that we've seen in the last couple years? Likely not, because the soils in the northern Corn Belt, when they get that rainfall, those soils will take it in because, they have been dry.
And how about the short-term temperature outlook?
Temperature outlook is really going to be pretty favorable. We're getting more of a southerly component to our airflow, and so that's going to keep things quite mild on the temperature scene.
So long-term, let's look maybe May, June, the beginning half of the growing season. What's your forecast for both precipitation and temperature?
I think we're going to see temperatures that are going to be generally near normal. It doesn't look like it's really going to be below normal until you get way, way southwest down into Texas. And for us, I think our temperature pattern is going to be quite seasonal. And for precipitation, the likelihood is that we're going to stay on that normal to maybe even above normal trail. And I think we're going to have pretty good moisture to work with as we get into that crop development phase.
So no blaring signs of warning?
No, there aren't. Again, the big issue is going to be over the western third of the state, and then you get farther on west and south. That's where the driest area is going to be, and probably the area of the country or the area of the central U.S. where the rainfall benefit shows up at the last.
In a few minutes, Nebraska Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher will give his forecast on temperatures and precipitation chances for Nebraska over the next week. The April Nebraska farmer says a growing number of producers are choosing conventional seed this year. In this month's issue, you can read about 2 northeast Nebraska farmers who plan to plant conventional seed this spring to lower costs and to capture high premiums being offered in their areas. But both producers stress you have to be more proactive in your weed control strategies with non-GMO soybeans and corn. The article says another challenge is that some seed companies don't have conventional seed available. You can learn more about the pros and cons of conventional seed in the April Nebraska Farmer. We told you in our previous episode several states in the country had recorded a case of the H5N2 avian flu, including Kansas, Minnesota, and Missouri. Late in the week, South Dakota joined the list after a commercial turkey flock in the east central part of the state was confirmed to have the virus. Additionally, at the time of this taping, 4 more commercial turkey flocks in Minnesota were known to have the H5N2 avian flu. For biosecurity precautions and more information on the virus, you can view our interview with Nebraska Extension poultry specialist Sheila Purdom from last week's episode. Many growers in the U.S. have embraced precision tools in agriculture as a way to more efficiently use fertilizers, chemicals, and other inputs. Nebraska Extension Cropping Systems educator Nathan Mueller recently talked with us about how much more accurate those tools have become. Nathan says those resources can now give farmers better information when making management decisions.
Something that's really come along, and there's a lot of options out there, is farm management software. And really having those tools, you can bring in different layers. And one of the things we've been collecting for a long time now is yield maps. But something that's probably a little bit more, that's been around for a while but not really used, is soil EC, or soil electrical conductivity. And that really helps us fine-tune the maps that were made by NRCS in the 60s and 70s. And they weren't mapped at the precision that we need for agriculture today. So meaning if there could be a 2.5 acre area in an area mapped as one soil, that isn't the same kind of soil. And 2.5 acres is enough that we want to manage that differently.
Why is that so critical to have it even more precision than it's already been?
Yeah, when we talk about developing variable rate applications, whether it's fertilizer, but the big one is seed. Growers and industry are really interested in variable rating corn seed or seed populations across the field. And then it really depends, your seeding map or your prescription map is only as good as your management zones. And so those management zones, you need different components to look at that. Yield history is great. Also, knowing your soils really well. I always ask you, you might know your banker's first name, but do you know your soil's first name? And knowing the characteristics of that soil. And so we can get a finer resolution map with that soil EC. It really picks out different textures across the field, and we know that those textures affect the plant available water.
That soil from one end of the field to the other, how much can it vary, and why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, it can vary from a silty clay in a river bottom to a sandy loam all in the same field in the matter of 100 feet. And so there's a lot of variability out there. And a lot of those boundaries or those areas that they mapped out, sometimes they got them pretty close, but maybe just shifted a little bit. Well, again, a 50-foot off is something we can now manage that we couldn't manage before in terms of precision ag.
Are you an advocate of using a lot of different tools or a lot of different mapping systems or types of maps in order to make recommendations?
Yes, I would say having multi-year yield history is a great layer to have. Also aerial photos, because you can get a higher resolution image of maybe what's going on in season and when you take those during the season. And then complementing that with a finer resolution soil map using soil EC, whether that's with an EM sled or a Veris rig. Both of those are great options. It's not real expensive. I know with the cost of inputs and the lower commodity prices, but for like the Veris rig, for example, that cost me about $15 per acre on my field. And you're also getting pH on the go, and you're getting an organic map of your field. And so just in the lime savings, only a quarter of my field needed lime. So I already paid for that. So I really got the EC and organic matter free in my case.
How difficult is this for someone to start using? If they've never done a lot of precision ag stuff before, is it, should they be timid about it?
No, we actually just finished up with 10 precision ag data management workshops across the state. And we had about 140 people attend, and that was in concert with Laura Thompson and Joe Luck. And so we had anywhere from beginners to more advanced uners, and we'll continue to offer those trainings this coming year, probably some out in western Nebraska this summer. So no, we're trying to work with producers to get them up to speed and utilizing the tools we have available.
The Crop Watch website has more information on precision ag tools. We'll link to those resources on the Market Journal homepage. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, the main focus was that upper air low moving out of the southwestern western United States into the central plains. Exactly, the precipitation was not nearly as much as was anticipated by the models. I think the models are really focusing more into a spring, early summer pattern where we have more moisture in the atmosphere. Hence, the precipitation totals just aren't there. And one of the primary focuses is that we're not seeing our high temperatures up strongly enough into the 70s, and our low temperatures have been consistently down into the upper 30s to the mid 40s. And we really want to see our low temperatures up into the low 50s before we could get good thunderstorm development. So the one thing I'm looking at is that at least we are seeing a progression of storms moving across the region. And just like last spring when we had the same problem, we're working with the northwest flow aloft. It took a while for us to build up that moisture in the atmosphere for those systems to work on. I think that's our same process that we're seeing right now. So I look at it as a positive sign that we're seeing an endless string of storms moving across the western United States. If we can just get the moisture entrained into these systems, we're going to start to see the precipitation break out rather dramatically across a good portion of the Corn Belt. In fact, if you go from Iowa eastward, I think the big news over this next 2-week period is going to be too much of a good thing, and that's really going to slow down planting intentions. Now, as we go to the upper air models, what we will see for today is that we have a trough once again moving into the Pacific Northwest, but this first system is not expected to have a dramatic impact on Nebraska as it moves and slides across the northern plains. We may see a slight cool down as we go into tomorrow, but as this system moves across the northern plains, we will see fairly nice conditions here in the state of Nebraska for today, but as we get into the evening hours, there is an indication we might see a low-level jet develop across the central plains, and some of that moisture may train itself up into south central Nebraska with a few isolated showers or thunderstorms, and then that will congeal maybe and move across southeastern Nebraska, but more importantly, it's probably going to hit north central and northeastern Kansas with more of the heavier precipitation. So by the time we get to tomorrow, we'll see that the upper air low is now moving toward the Great Lakes. A slight cool down because the cold air is going to be pressing in the northern part of the state we'll be looking at about 5 degrees lower in highs tomorrow. And then as we get into Monday, that system rapidly moves into the Great Lakes and we see ridging taking place aloft. And what that means is we're going to have a couple nice days ahead of us. Statewide, we'll be looking primarily at all areas in the 70s except extreme northeastern Nebraska, where we may be more in the mid to upper 60s. And by Tuesday, more of the same things, but we now have another trough that is starting to approach the western United States and digging into the central Rockies. And we also have the remnants and upper air lows moving across the southern plains that is sort of expected to start lifting some moisture up into Nebraska. So the combination of this low moving forward and this low level moisture in place, there is a chance that we're going to start to see some widespread precipitation breaking out late Tuesday and more importantly on Wednesday. And if this system even slows down a little bit more, we will get a much better moisture output from this system, as there will be much more moisture in place for the system to work on. So by the time we get to Wednesday, we'll see the system moving into the western part of the state. On the backside, we'll start to filter in some cold air. We might actually see some light snow breaking out and across the northwestern panhandle. But more importantly, as this system moves toward eastern Nebraska, we could see a line of very severe thunderstorms developing from Minnesota all the way down through Texas. And on the backside, we'll be in the colder air, more stratiform rain, and the potential for accumulation of snow and grassy surfaces across central and northern Nebraska. By the time we get to Friday, this system starts to cut itself off over the eastern Corn Belt, which will mean a few days of consistent precipitation, and that will include the backside with waves of precipitation breaking out across eastern Nebraska. For the western part of the state, clearing skies and cold air funneling down, and we may actually see some freezing temperatures dropping all the way down into the Texas Panhandle. So as we look at the temperature forecast, you see the warmer temperatures hold through the middle of next week, but we see that increasing chance of shower activity with potential snow also late in the week. 8 to 14-day forecast indicates the cold air will remain in place, and in terms of precipitation, normal to above normal precipitation from the Rockies eastward.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, corn diseases, an outlook at spring planting weather, and precision ag tools. As always, you can follow Market Journal during the week on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Daryl Peel will analyze cattle markets and Luke Beckman will look at corn and soybean markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.